Hello! In this video, we're going to evaluate Kantian Deontology a little bit, think about should we agree with Kant's theory or not, with his views about how we should act. Should we follow the principle of humanity that says always treat others always as ends and not just as means, and always act only on those maxims that we could will to be a universal law? What do we think of those ideas about how we should act? And his sort of general idea that acting on a universal law is how we respect another's autonomy, and that's really what we should be doing. So, well, he thinks there are a couple of different arguments in Kant's texts, and we're not going to look at all of them for his conclusions that the principle of humanity and principle of universal law are accurate. But he thinks that, among other things, his theory gives us the best explanation of a lot of our moral views, and you might think that the true moral theory is in fact the best explanation of our moral views. This is not by any means Kant's only argument, but it's one of them in effect. Why would he think that his view gives the best explanation of lots of our moral views? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that rationality and autonomy do seem to be valuable. To lots of people, a lot of the time anyway, that seems fairly plausible. Among other things that are valuable, they seem valuable. Also, acting on universalizable maxims does seem to be a way to respect others' rationality and autonomy. If I act on a maxim that's universalizable, then I'm saying, you too, in pursuing your plans, could behave in the same way that I am behaving. And if I don't act on a universalizable maxim, then maybe I'm not acting in that way. I'm treating myself as special, acting in a way that you couldn't, in some sense, also act. And you might think that the two principles support our moral intuitions about particular cases, and in the readings, Kant gives a bunch of examples where he thinks that that's correct. So what do we think about this argument that, in fact, the principle of humanity, the principle of universal law, really summarize all of our different moral duties? One thing to note about this argument is that it's actually not valid. And it's not presented as if it's valid, but it isn't. It's if the premises are true, the conclusion is likely to be true, but not guaranteed to be true. But the concern I'm going to focus on is this top premise. So, in fact, do Kant's principles of universal law and humanity, do they support our moral intuitions about particular cases? And I've put our in quotes here because we may actually have different intuitions about some of these cases, and in particular, different intuitions about the Omelas case and the different trolley cases. So let's think about how Kant's principles would apply to those cases. So let's think about first the principle of humanity, and that tells us always treat humanity and others as an end and not just as a means. It's okay if we treat it as a means, but if we do, we always have to treat humanity as an end also in others. And by humanity, Kant means rational autonomy, our ability to act for reasons. So it seems that imprisoning the child to benefit the city certainly does not treat the child as an end. It interferes with the child's ability to live their own life as they see fit. Children aren't capable of doing that as much as an adult is, but it's still a radical interference in that child's autonomy. Again, when you push someone off the bridge to get their body in front of the trolley to block the trolley, you are not treating them as an end. It doesn't seem like you're not respecting their ability to make choices about their life. You're using them. In both these cases, you're straightforwardly using somebody else in a way that they haven't consented to get your own ends. Actually, not just your own ends, to benefit not just yourself but others, but you're still using them. When you redirect the trolley, you're not using that one person as an end, but you might think, well, I'm not using them because it's not critical to my saving the 5 that this other person be killed. I would prefer that they not be killed, but nonetheless, you might think you're discounting their value. You're going to end up interfering with their ability to live their life as they see fit, even though you're not actually using them. So maybe it's not that you're using them, but you're still treating them like a tool in the sense that you can leave a hammer out in the rain or a tool out in the rain and you haven't done anything morally wrong. You haven't wronged the hammer or the tool, the computer, whatever it is. So there's some vagueness here. Is it always wrong to use another? What about if you could save 5 billion people by killing one person? What if there were 5 billion people down the train track, right? Well, of course, it trolley wouldn't make it through 5 billion people, but, it was a nuclear weapon or something like that. Is it always wrong to use another? Maybe that's what Kant's principle tells us. It's not clear. So there are ways in which the principle of humanity is a little bit vague, but at least it does seem to give a fairly straightforward explanation of why it would be wrong to imprison the child and to push someone off the bridge, and perhaps wrong to redirect the trolley. Now you might think, I don't share those moral intuitions, but Kant is at least motivated by the idea that it would be wrong, for example, to imprison the child. And so in this way, the principle of humanity is doing what he wants it to do. It's giving what he thinks are the right judgments about those cases. So he's going to say, good, he's going to like that result. But what about the universal law principle? Right? So what is your maxim consider this maxim: I will imprison an innocent child if doing so will greatly benefit the city. So let's ask, right, certainly in doing so you would be using the child as, you would not be respecting the child's humanity, but could this maxim nonetheless be a universal law? Maybe the maxims, Kant's two principles about universal law and humanity disagree. Could I will this to be a universal law? Well, on the one hand, if you did will it to be a universal law, then it would have been a law that you would have been subject to as a child, as an innocent child, and so you can't necessarily. And so you might think, well, no, it would be irrational for me to will this as a universal law, because after all, I might have, in a society in which people did follow this maxim, I could have been subject as an innocent child to being imprisoned for the benefit of the city, and I don't want that, and that would interfere with my own plans to live my life as I see fit, and so it would be irrational for me to will this maxim as a universal law. On the other hand, you would think, well, but I'm not a child now, and so maybe I don't need to worry about what would happen if I had been a child, because I wasn't. More importantly, though, and I think, well, look, there are many, 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 many people in the city, and only one child. Maybe it's worth the gamble. Maybe it's worth the gamble to be born into a city where one child is imprisoned and everyone else greatly benefits by that imprisonment. Like, yeah, it's a risk I'm taking because I could end up being that child, but on the other hand, I'm risking the cost of being that child, but I'm also risking, maybe I get all these benefits of living in this wonderful city, because it turns out I'm not the child that gets imprisoned and I grow up and have a wonderful life in the city. So maybe actually it's worth it. Right? So on the one hand, the intuition is that this maxim is definitely wrong. I shouldn't act on it. But maybe it could be a universal law, because maybe it's actually reasonable for me to say, yes, this is a risk I'm willing to take. Well, how should we decide that? It's not clear. So it's not clear that Kant's principle of universal law does it or doesn't it support our moral intuitions about Omelas? Is it okay to imprison the child? It's not clear what the universal law principle says about that. And the same thing is true with the trolley. On the one hand, think, well, I'm not going to, here's this maxim, I will put another in harm's way, another in harm's way. If doing so will benefit many more others. Well, is that universalizable? You might think, no, it's not, because if I live in a society where people follow this maxim, then they might put me at risk in ways that would benefit many others, and then they're doing so, they're directing the trolley at me or pushing me off the bridge. It would be dangerous to live in a society where people were willing to do that, because then maybe I would get pushed off the bridge, or maybe I would get the trolley redirected at me, and that would interfere with my ability to live my life as I see fit. On the other hand, like, well, there are 5 people down. It's much more likely that I'm the person who's tied up down the track than I am the person who's going to be pushed, or the person who gets the trolley redirected at them. And so maybe I think, yeah, I actually would like to live in a society where one person is sacrificed for 5, because I'm more likely to be one of the 5 than I am to be one of the 1, and that's a gamble that's worth taking. So the intuition is that it's definitely wrong to push the person off the bridge. But maybe it could be a universal law. Push people off bridges to stop trolleys from killing 5 people because you're more likely to be saved by the by a trolley being stopped than you are to be used to stop a trolley. It's not obvious how we would go to figure that out. So again, does Kant's principle of universal law, what does Kant's principle of universal law tell us to do in the trolley cases? It's not clear. Where one might think, okay, that's an opportunity to do more philosophy. Maybe so. But if we're thinking about, as things stand right now, about how well do Kant's different principles explain our intuitions about these moral cases, well, the universal law maxim seems like it has trouble telling us what to do in any of these cases, in the Omelas case, the bridge case, or the trolley case. Maybe that means we need to think more about how that maxim would work. Fair enough, but it's an open question, and that's a problem. That's at least a deficit in Kant's argument. The humanity maxim seems to more clearly tell us, don't imprison the child, don't push someone off the bridge. It's not as clear about what we should do in the trolley case. And this raises a further problem. Kant wants these two principles, always act on a law that could be, always act on a maxim that could be universal law, and always act on a maxim that treats humanity as an end. He wants those two to always coincide. They're supposed to coincide. They're always supposed to agree. They're just two different ways of stating the same requirement. And here it looks like maybe they don't. So Kant has some problems. The principle of humanity is vague. It's not clear how it should apply when we are considering the trolley redirection case, and more generally, when can we sacrifice somebody for one person for the welfare of many. The principles humanity and universal law do not apparently always agree, because the universal law maxim is hard to apply in these cases where the humanity maxim seems fairly clear. And then the principle of universal law seems to allow, in fact, apparently immoral actions, like it may allow us to imprison the child in Omelas. So the principle of universal law seems like it's a bit of a problem for Kant. It has some intuitive attraction, but when we try to actually apply it, it gets hard to do. So, when we think about why should we be Kantian, this idea that the two principles support our moral intuitions about particular cases, that's not so obvious. Once we start trying to take those two principles of humanity and universal law and apply them to the Omelas case and the trolley cases, it gets confusing pretty quickly. And that means that, at the very least, if we're going to be a Kantian, we need to figure out how to further develop the principles to explain how they apply in those cases. So that's a worry we might have. So I want to sort of summarize where we are both with Kantian views and utilitarian views. So deontology, Kant's idea, does seem to explain some of our moral intuitions. Certain acts are wrong, not even though they maximize utility. And why are they wrong? Because they violate the autonomy of others. You can't use someone else just to benefit. You can't use one person as a tool to benefit others. Not in all cases, anyway. And but it's not clear what the boundaries of autonomy are, in exactly when does it protect you, and when does your autonomy protect you from being used by others, and when doesn't it? And the universal law idea doesn't always tell us that's what it's supposed to do, so that's a problem. It's not clear how to balance autonomy and outcomes. Right? You're autonomous, good. At what, which things first of all would count as violations of your autonomy, and then when is it actually maybe okay to violate your autonomy or my autonomy, because doing so would really be super beneficial for lots of other people. So what are the boundaries of my autonomy, and when can they be crossed? And then finally, we don't have an argument for the value of autonomy, at least not that we've seen. Kant thinks it's obvious. In other places, he sort of tries to argue for it, but it's not obvious why. Can we give an argument for it? Maybe we can't. Maybe it just is valuable, or maybe an argument can be given for it. Well, it's just sort of obviously valuable, or maybe we can give an argument for it. It's not obviously valuable to everybody, so we might wonder, well, maybe we need an argument for it? So utilitarianism seems problematic. because autonomy is important and utilitarianism doesn't recognize that value, at least not explicitly. Maybe it can be fixed up so that it does, but as it stands, it doesn't. And Kantianism is limited because we want to know why and how more precisely is autonomy important. So this is a somewhat frustrating situation, perhaps. We think, oh, well, okay, there's an opportunity to do more philosophy here. We need to start answering, sort of trying to figure that out. We think autonomy is important, we think happiness is important, but we're not clear about how their importances relate to each other. Kant hasn't really told us. We need to do some more exploration. And that's one attitude you might have to this. I mean, you might think, no, one of these is obviously right, or you might think, no, more exploration needs to be done. Those are different attitudes you might have. In thinking about these issues, there's another problem that so far I haven't talked about, and which has surfaced just a little bit in the Kant reading that we've already done, and which shows up elsewhere to a much greater and worse degree with no excuse for what we've already seen, just that it's even worse elsewhere. But Kant was explicitly racist. So in the groundwork, he says, and we find him saying the following. He says, he finds that a system of nature could very well include a law that every man, like the South Sea Islander, could allow his talents to rust away while he devotes his life simply to idleness, enjoyment, and sex, in short, to a life of pleasure-seeking. So what Kant's saying a couple of different things there. He's talking about what our moral duties are, in his view, to develop our talents or just to seek pleasure, and in saying that we have in that discussion and in that sentence, he says that so-called South Sea Islanders do not develop their talents and instead devote themselves to a life of pleasure. South Sea Islanders, who is Kant talking about? He's talking about the people who in his time lived in the Pacific Ocean, so perhaps New Zealand, certainly Polynesia, Micronesia, the people who lived in Hawaii, and so on, that group of people. And he's making a racist comment about them. He's saying they're all lazy and devoting their lives to pleasure. So it's racist and it's mistaken, as I'll discuss in some other videos. Among other things, Polynesians were extraordinarily skilled open water navigators. And we'll talk a little bit about that in another video. But the question is, we need to know this about him, and how does this fact that he had these abhorrent and false views, how does that bear on the ideas we've just been discussing? You might think, well, they're deeply contradictory. Kant says all humans should be respected, because in virtue of their autonomy, and here he is being profoundly disrespectful. How do these integrate? Was he just a hypocrite, or is there something more complicated going on? Is he somehow sort of disguising and smuggling his racism into what we've been discussing, but the ideas we've been discussing we didn't notice? What's going on there? So we're going to need to discuss those, both because they're important for thinking about Kant, but also because it's an example of a problem that we run across basically when we think about lots and lots of thinkers from the European intellectual history. So we're going to need to discuss that general issue of, we find a thinker, they have some racist views, they have some other views. How do we sort of think about the relationship between their problematic racist views and the other stuff they said that certainly doesn't, at least at first blush, look racist? So we're going to be discussing that issue, but we're not going to be discussing it in our next module. We're going to discuss it in the module after next. Why am I putting this discussion off? Well, because in the next module, we're going to be discussing Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche criticizes the whole idea of moral theorizing, so he's critical of both Mill and Kant on grounds that don't have to do with this racism issue, but with other grounds. And it turns out also that some of the more contemporary critics of Kant who have worried about his racism and how we should how that racism and that mistake of his bears on the ideas we've been discussing. How do they interrelate? Well, some of Nietzsche's ideas are used in thinking about that topic. So we've seen Kant. He has this focus on autonomy. He thinks it's important. He thinks it sort of takes us beyond utilitarianism. There's some problems with how he wants to articulate that. In the next module, we're going to see someone who's criticizing both Kant and the Mill, and then in the module after that, we're going to come back and think about how does the racism in some of these Western thinkers' minds bear on some of their ideas that do not look explicitly racist.